So, according to the schedule, we're pretty much out of time for my presentation. But I'm going to take my 20 minutes. So you all have been sitting a long time already. So maybe let's just like arm stretch and try to get our mind. You're going to sit some more and listen. I'm going to move really fast, but know that they're going to post these slides so you can peruse them at your will later. So bear with me. And a lot of you are New Yorkers in the room, so you're used to fast talking, so I'm going to dive right in. Okay, so I'm going to present you with a lot of national and state patterns in school discipline and show you bar graphs and line graphs, but I don't want this data to leave us cold, okay? We just heard the stories of a lot of young people, and I think that really brings it to life for us. Discipline incidents are fraught experiences. There's high stress, a sense of unfair treatment. And on top of that, a single suspension can have real consequences. So many of us who work in schools know that when a student gets suspended, they can get behind in their coursework, they can get more alienated from school, and all of this can snowball if they go into the neighborhoods and group up with other kids committing more serious rule breaking, and eventually this can snowball, leading to dropout. I entered into this work in 1995. I was working at a large urban elementary school, and there was some talk of the racial achievement gap. But I kept trying to raise my hand saying, why aren't we talking about who's getting sent out of class and lining up outside the principal's door? And so people said, shh, we can't talk about that. So I'm so glad I'm here today to talk more about this issue that's gained so much more national attention. And I've been shining a spotlight on the issue of racial equity and discipline for the last decade. Now, before moving into talking about RJ and RP, I want to just present some national trends briefly. I think all of us in the room are well aware of these trends, so some of this just to kind of bring us back and what our situation is here in the U.S. So here we have the trends in the percentage of middle and high school students who receive one or more suspensions, and we see some slight upticks for Latino students over the last decades. But here we have in the orange line the dramatic increase for African American students. And I've noticed over the years that people really try to explain away this line. They might assert that it's really about, achievement gaps. Or they might assert it's really about disproportionate representation in special ed, or maybe the risks associated with high rates of poverty. However, I can confidently tell you from rigorous studies that achievement lags, poverty gaps, and special ed referrals do not explain away racial disparities. One of the more rigorous studies, and many of you may be familiar with this study that came out of Texas, they followed middle school over time. And as a researcher, I was really pleased to say it's a very rigorous study. They controlled for 83 risk factors, including student special ed status, their low achievement, economic disadvantage, and what they found was very dramatic. So comparing an otherwise identical white and Latino student, African American students had a 31% higher likelihood of school discretionary discipline action. So this suggests to me African American students are being treated more harshly. They might be picked out for discipline more often and then sanctioned more severely. So again, many of us know this from looking at this data and living and breathing in schools. But this kind of large state study kind of can take your breath away. And there's other groups to be concerned about. We know there's a large gender gap, what's happening for male students in discipline. In some parts of the country, Latino students are similarly overrepresented relative to African American students. There's more and more recognition of the policing of black females in schools. And finally, there was a national study that came out that really shone the spotlight on LGBT youth's experience in schooling and concerns about differential treatment with that group. Suspension can become a way schools are managing behavior and even managing difference. So what results is the process of deporting and detaining instead of correcting and re-engaging. And this is particularly concerning because we don't have evidence that exclusionary discipline, removing students from class and from the school building, is really effective. So let me just stop and back up some claims there with some research. So the first thing I want to point out here is that we see there's some really serious consequences for suspension. We look across the blue bars, we see 50 to 60% of non-disciplined youth go on for some college coursework. On the contrary, only 20% or so of students with 10 or more days of suspension go on for later coursework. And this is from a nationally representative study from across the U.S. Now, in a rigorously controlled study, so again, we're accounting for the risks that lead to dropout, so poverty, special ed status, course failures, and attendance. Balfons found that, in fact, each additional suspension further decreased a student's odds of graduating by 20%. So you see kind of this arrow leading down towards dropout. So again, sometimes I've had teachers say to me, well, I'm surprised, it's just a small suspension, it's no big deal. But again, I mentioned that snowball issue that we really need to take seriously here as we work on discipline reform. And of course, many of you know this term, the school-to-prison pipeline. Has been mentioned a few times today. And the Texas study also looked at this. And again, using rigorous statistical analyses, they found that accounting for 83 different risk factors, a student who had been disciplined more than 11 times faced a 1 in 5 chance of a juvenile justice contact. And some more data from the national study that I mentioned earlier shows that we see here, for example, that 38% of frequently suspended African American males experience confinement in adult or juvenile facilities, relative to only less than 10% of black males who had never been suspended. So again, we see some dramatic differences here between the green bars of kids who were suspended for 10 or more days and the blue bars with kids who had never been suspended. So where does this leave us? Again, many of us know this data. I believe it pushes us to consider how can we go from deporting and disciplining to resolving and educating, and I think that's why we're all here. And I worked with a large team of scholars, lawyers, and practitioners, and we met with groups across the country, and we put together a brief on what schools can do to reduce disparities in discipline. And I want to point out that we clustered ideas in the notion of prevention, which is very key when we're thinking about engaging students in learning. And then the idea of intervention. What can we do to support students' learning as they work through the tricky ages in brain development, as was mentioned, of adolescence? So restorative practices, I believe, can tap into many of the ideas listed here. We have building supporting relationships, reducing bias in the classrooms, approaching conflict through problem solving. But many of us are ready to go beyond gap gazing. So let's consider moving schools towards resolving and educating. So now I'm going to turn to restorative approaches to discipline. And a quick refresher for those of you who are newer to these practices, although there's many people who've been doing this work for a while, so you guys can kind of fade out for a second. Well, we know here that restorative practices is a nice summary. Focuses on relationship building. It's really this key building block for prevention and intervention. It gives voice to the person who is harmed. We don't get that in school, a formal forum for the voices of those who are harmed to participate. There's a collaborative problem solving, and I think what we want to think when we hear that collaborative problem solving is kids learning social and emotional learning skills. This is an opportunity to learn through conflict. And then finally, I think it's important that there's this idea of repairing harm, and we hear this a lot, the idea of repairing harm. But I think we could all get t-shirts, repairing harm, and tattoos, because I think it's such a lovely, evocative phrase for us to think about making a community whole again, or a person whole again. So quick about this idea of RJ and RP. There's all this terminology being thrown around, and I don't want to get too caught up in it. But for some folks, the idea of RJ, restorative justice, is a theory of justice that emphasizes repairing harm. And restorative practices often reference a broader range of RJ approaches that proactively build community based on cooperation, mutual understanding, trust, and respect. And so now I want to spend a few minutes giving you some flavor of what's happening across the nation when it comes to different school districts implementing these practices. So this might be small font for some of you in the back, but this is Fairfax County Public Schools. And what I want to point out in their graphic here is they go from RJ prevention, and then they slide all the way up to RJ intervention. So there's practices at the classroom level, everybody gets them, all the way up to RJ intervention. Those are for more serious rule infractions. They have restorative justice conferencing. Here's SF Unified, San Francisco. They're using the triangle like a lot of folks do here in New York too, and Oakland. Tier 1, so folks working in schools, they know all about this multi-tiered system of support. Tier 1, I want to point out, it's a universal level. That means everyone is getting exposed to something. So, for example, they have community building class circles. In community building circles, teachers gather students literally into a circle with no obstruction in the middle. So everyone is facing each other. You see each other's faces, each other's bodies. There's a meaningful exchange while sitting in a circle. They have a talking piece that gets circulated. We're going to see that in some videos today. The talking piece is key because it opens up opportunities for every voice to be heard in that room. So it's a way of increasing sense of belonging and inclusion in the classroom. And the other, I think, key piece of community building circles is the idea of relevancy to youth. A lot of the topics that kids are discussing in those circles are very real, lived realities of those students. It's a chance for teachers and educators to see a different side of those young people. At Tier 2, students here would get more behavioral supports. They might participate in a responsive circle where they're doing problem solving around a kind of lower level problem that came up. And then Tier 3, again, has this more intensive restorative conferencing. I'm most familiar with the International Institute of Restorative Practices Continuum. And this also moves from prevention using affect, the idea of engaging emotion and empathy in all of our dialogue in school, to all the way up to formal conferencing. So responsive circles might be done in a classroom, for instance, where there's something negative happening, there's something in the classroom in terms of classroom management or some dynamic, and a teacher would say, okay, let's circle up, we need to deal with what's happening here and now, let's problem solve, let's correct this, let's prevent this from happening in the future. So instead of the teacher kind of standing on the chair and screaming at everyone and flashing lights, they engage people and say, let's acknowledge what's happening in this moment and let's come up, this is not how we want this learning environment. Formal conferencing instead is a more scripted, structured approach with a pre-meeting. Facilitators are highly trained to guide bringing in families and problem solving. And I think what's key in the restorative conferencing is that accountability for wrongdoing is central. I'm going to say that again because I think this is kind of this controversial point about restorative practice. Accountability is central to this process, where someone who's done harm has to go eye to eye with someone that they've harmed or a community that they've harmed. But there's also a piece of this which is about reintegrating the wrongdoer or the disputant back into the community and not stigmatizing them, shunning them, shutting them out. It's to say, let's heal this together. Let's bring you back in. We already heard some of the restorative questions today that are used regularly. And I think what I want to point out with these questions is that the questions are asked to both the disputant and those harmed. Again, for those of you who have been exposed to this, you say, oh yeah, I know those questions. But I think what's key is we don't often have a process where those harmed get to tell their story. And then what's the power of this is the person who's done the harm hears it. Oh, I didn't realize that. I was hearing a story of a teacher who was getting some threats through social media from a student. And then the teacher talked about how scared she had. She was so afraid at night. She got her whole family, everyone was worked up about these threats. And the student said, I was just joking. I didn't know it was going to be such a big deal. And it was really eye-opening for him to see the impact of his actions. So what would a classroom look like? I've been very intrigued with this kind of notion of what does a highly restorative classroom look and feel like? When you walk in, what happens? And so what I've done is I've collected data from students. What did they experience highly restorative classrooms like? And they answer affirmatively to the following questions. Teachers talk respectfully about feelings. They use the restorative questions on a regular basis. They're engaging, there's conflict in classrooms, they're quickly engaging using these questions. They circle their students up, they actually run what are called the proactive community building circles. They engage in something called fair process, they explain their decision making, and they also use responsive circles. So in a small scale study, I showed that teachers who use these practices more from the student's eye view have a small racial discipline gap when it comes to kicking students out for disruption and defiance, kicking Latino and African American students out for for disruption defiance. You're going to see that at this end. See how it's narrower there. Now, low RP classrooms, that's where the students are perceiving these teachers are doing very little of what I just listed. They have a much larger racial discipline gap. They're asking African American and Latino students to leave at much higher rates for what they perceive as disruption and defiance. So this is a nice transition for me now. I've presented some data on RP. So let me go through now and give you a speed tour of the research on restorative practices. Everyone still with me? Yeah. Okay, good. We're together here. Okay, so first of all, we must recognize and get away from kind of America-centrism and know that this work has been going on much longer outside of the U.S. And there's been some really good research done around the globe. And I would say the take-home message from the international research that I've read is that there's many studies that have shown restorative practices move schools away from using exclusionary discipline. But there's also more and more single case studies, as what we would call them, in the U.S. So here's an example of a school that just tracked its data, putting RP in and post-RP. That's the blue bars versus the red bars. We see dramatic declines. And we've seen this school after school in this nation. So, and with all different kinds of demographics and compositions of the school, we do see that overall RP helps schools move away from using exclusionary discipline. And now more and more we're seeing whole districts release reports. And a recent report that we'll probably reference in different ways throughout the day, so I strongly recommend looking this up, shows that for African American students, suspension rates have gone down. So they looked across 3 years of RJ implementation. And what's really poignant about this evaluation was that the greatest declines were in the category of disruption and defiance for African American kids, which is one of those subjective discipline categories where African American kids have been disproportionately represented all over the place in this country. So it's really exciting to me to see inroads around that category in particular. And I would also say, for those of you who are kind of statsy oriented in the group, these findings held up when they looked at RJ schools versus non-RJ schools, and they followed a cohort of students controlling for risk. So in other words, they had some increasing confidence that it's actually true that there's been some black and white suspension gap narrowing in Oakland. So we'll have to all keep our eyes out to see where Oakland is going. So in another district in Denver, they've released a lot of their data, and since 2006, they've been rolling out restorative practices in a phased way for many years. And they have a close to 40% reduction in the use of suspension and expulsion. And I worked with them recently analyzing some data, and I found that students who participated in a conference in the fall had a lower probability of receiving a discipline referral in the spring. And they had a lower probability of receiving out-of-school suspension. So what's exciting about this is this finding held up when we took into account the severity and frequency of the referral. So something about the conferencing made us believe there's a protective effect. It's reducing, in justice language, recidivism. There's some magical process happening for those kids in that conference. So I think this more and more research is starting to really convince us that there is something protective about this conferencing. But I should also point out at the same time in Denver, as of 2013, the racial discipline gap has persisted. Now, in the data I just showed you, only 5% of the referred students received conferences, mediations, or circles. So there's a lot more to do to diffuse practices in Denver, and I know schools vary tremendously in their implementation. So it'd be important to look closer at specific schools to see if their gap has reduced. So I just presented a lot of different research, and here's my take-home message for them. I think we can be confident restorative practices move schools away from exclusionary approaches. Whether they reduce racial disparities, we still have to keep tracking that, and we have to think very carefully about the allocation of this new innovation to make sure all students are getting it, and we need high quality, and I'm going to be talking about that high quality implementation. We also don't have rigorous experimental research. I didn't present any randomized controlled trial results, so we don't, from that research paradigm, we don't know if restorative practices causes change. But in my opinion, it's a good thing that the federal government is using our tax dollars to help fund some randomized controlled trials. So let's keep our eyes out for the studies coming out of these states in the coming year. So a lot of these are just launching now. Okay, but I also want to leave you with another message about the research. We need to go way beyond discipline, referrals, and suspensions. We need to think about these positive outcomes. Of course, there is fear that folks are just not entering the data, that there's a suppression effect, that we don't want to suspend the kid, but let's really suspend them, but let's just not enter it in the system. And let's figure out how to get away around this paperwork, because now everyone's watching us on our suspension rates, and we don't want that. And I've talked to a lot of administrators who talk about in kind of vague terms this whole process of not entering data. So it is concerning. But I would also say I have not seen evidence, despite the newspaper accounts, that there's negative ripple effects of restorative practice, where kids are just running hog wild in the hallways and running amok. If anyone has data on that, please let me know. I have not found that yet, but I'm looking for it. I haven't found it. But Oakland's report has some very interesting teacher surveys, because the teachers perceive RJ has helped our school climate, build caring adult relationships, and help students' conflict resolution skills. So from the practitioners who are surveyed, they're seeing something, they're perceiving something happening in their schools. What's also striking about the Oakland report is they did find positive upticks in attendance in RJ schools and positive upticks in reading proficiency. So that's exciting, that we're starting to move beyond this idea of reducing exclusionary discipline, which I think is very important, but we need to look at this positivity, re-engaging students. I think that's what we all want. So we all care about. We just don't want this one tool taken out of the toolbox, and then there's no other kinds of learning through problem-solving processes happening. The other thing I want to point out, in the Oakland schools, the schools who were implementing it the best, the furthest along, had the biggest positive changes. So that moves me into fidelity of implementation. So this kind of sounds like this technical term, but all of you know, because you're here at a workshop, that you can get enthusiastic, and then you go back and nothing changes. So many initiatives come our way, it's so hard to know what to prioritize. Once you leave a training, you get in your classroom, and there's so much they expect from you. And then this teacher goes on to say, we have a training, and maybe the next week teachers will go in and use those circles, and then it gets lost. And I've seen this again and again, the initial upswing of use and then the decline. So it's really incumbent upon educators to really stick with it. Don't let homeostasis pull us back or the enthusiasm fizzle. Changing behavior is challenging. Infusing high-quality restorative practices is a tall order, and I think it's incumbent upon all folks involved in education to really think carefully about implementation fidelity. So how well was the program implemented? So say we discover that the implementation was patchy, which frankly happens all the time. It's a variable quality. Some teachers are just rocking it out, it's doing really well. And some students are just, they're just moving towards it. This is so different, this is so much better. Then you notice there's some patches of promise. How do we leverage those resources in the school where it's really taking and learn from them, shine a positive light? So fidelity of implementation can help us iteratively improve how we're implementing. So I'm going to get very kind of academic here, and I'm going to show you something. I love these things called multifaceted models. So a couple things we want to think sophisticatedly about fidelity. So there's 3 domains here. How well is the program delivered? How well was it received? And then to what extent do participants enact what was learned? So dosage. When we think about fidelity, how much of this was implemented in the school? So I would say right now, we don't have a magic dosage. We don't know how well infused before there's ripple effects that change the school climate. So for instance, can community building circles, should they be implemented 3 times a week in every classroom? Or is once a week in advisory enough to change the school culture? So there's some questions for us to consider. Now for quality, what does high quality conferences look and feel like, or circles? For that matter, what are the typical ways circles go awry that reinforce negative patterns in the school? And then when we think about racial disparities, what does a high-quality conference look and feel like when it increases sense of trust, decreases suspicion, and decreases implicit bias, and decreases alienation, and connects the family to the school? In Australia, let's see, I'm going to move to, in Australia, we know from this study some of the kind of magic qualities of a good conference. We see here that most participants said they had their voice heard. So we need to make sure, if this is one of our critical high-quality indicators, how much do students feel heard in a well-run conference? And then 80% of the wrongdoers were affected by the emotions of those who had been hurt, and this made them feel bad. And this is called perspective taking, the idea that you can put yourself in someone else's shoes, and this idea of empathy development is key. And then they had positive outcomes. They followed these folks later, and they found that the victims in these cases reported that the disputes, the people who were harmed, had improved. I'd like to take the victim's word for it, right? That something had shifted. There was also low re-referral rates back into the system. So this study, again, we're getting down to the nitty-gritty of what does a high-quality conference look like, integrates voice, integrates perspective. And of course, I'm just going to end today by just thinking about this idea. We don't want to run an intervention. Our ideal scenario is we run an intervention and folks learn something from the process, right? Something social and emotional learning, they get reconnected. For instance, in the Minneapolis public schools, they instituted a family group conferencing process for students up for expulsion. And then the students reported after the conference that they now understand their impact of their behavior on people around them. So again, it's that perspective taking that those students report they've carried with them. They've generalized. They've learned something in the process and they take it with them. So I want to end with some upbeat words from the youths themselves that we recently interviewed about their experience of restorative conferencing. A Latino male said, even outside of here, you have it in your head. I've done this like 5 times already. I got in trouble. I did the questions right there in my head. They looked at me like, what? But I'm nothing. I'm just doing the restorative questions. So he's actually literally running it through his head to figure out how to deal with the situation. Then we have a white male high school student said, I learned how to handle a situation if it comes up next time, like taking action steps for how to fix a problem, like cause and effect. Now I generally handle them in a more respectful way, just talking to the person. And an African-American female high school student we interviewed said, I actually learned how to listen, and after having a few one-on-ones with that same person, it just clicks in my head. I learned how to express myself and tell how I really feel before I get mad. They seem to have internalized some of these processes. They're managing their emotions differently and conflict differently. So now, think RP infusion in a whole school. We would have also school staff thinking differently, managing emotions differently, engaging in conflict differently. It's this notion of a restorative mindset. This might mean students are actively investing in relationship building and community building. They're slowing down to manage conflict differently in the hallways, in the cafeterias, also in the parent-teacher meetings where we know there can be strife. They're engaging parents differently. So I think this is an exciting image to leave us with, and collectively I would say we can join forces and keep working together for such positive transformations. Thank you for your attention this morning.
Dr. Gregory, thank you so much. I can tell you that, and I assure you that this group here today, this group goes back and changes everything. That's what they're here to do today.